Hello, loyal audience. Welcome back to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. I found an article online which contains the following statement. In a moment of existential dread, the nation's podcast hosts all suddenly realized that all they do is bring on other podcast hosts and interview them about each other's podcasts. It has taken me 130 episodes, but here I finally am. Parenthesis, if you run a podcast and I have had you on the show as a guest before, apologies. But today's guest is one who I finally decided to have on the podcast because she runs a podcast of her own now, and I wanted to bring it to your attention because it's an excellent listen. And if you like this one, you will probably like that one. And so I'm going to put my cards on the table here and say that this is not an episode that is primarily about a set of ideas presented in a recent publication, which is what most of the episodes are. But it is someone I just really wanted to talk to for a number of reasons, which I'll explain in a moment, and who I thought would make for a really fun guest, and that was in fact the case. So my guest is Johanna Hanink, who is a professor of classics at Brown University, and has done all of the things that you would expect a classics professor to do, including publishing books on ancient Athenian tragedy, the making of tragedy, translating ancient literature like Thucydides and so on for the Princeton How to Think About series. This one is How to Think About War, an Ancient Guide to Foreign Policy. But all of these things merely make Johanna a very accomplished classicist, which, listener, does not clear the threshold for being invited onto this podcast. No, what she has done is something very extraordinary in academia, which was, after establishing your name in your own field, the one you were trained in, to actually move into a different field and write a very interesting book about something quite different, which requires not only learning additional skills, in this particular case, a language, a modern Greek, but immersing yourself in that culture at a particular moment in its history and writing a book about it, and then also translating an important work of modern Greek literature from the early 20th century. This is Andreas Karkavitsas is the Archaeologist, and publishing it with Penguin Classics, which is a very difficult feat to do. Any of you who have published books know how impossible that fortress is to breach. But there are very few works of modern Greek literature in there. Let me also state that there are very few works of medieval East Roman literature in there, or medieval Greek. There is Procopius, there's Psellos, there's Anakomnini. Well, it depends on how you treat some of the early church fathers. Athanasius' Life of Antony. Anyway, this for me raised some interesting questions that I thought would form the basis for a fascinating discussion, which is in fact what we had, in part about diachronic Greek literature. In other words, there are institutions and ideologies that promote the study of classical Greek literature, and there are institutions and an obvious national interest in the promotion of modern Greek literature, and there are many bridges between the two. We discussed some of them, as you will see. But what happens about all the stuff in between? I happen to believe that there is tremendous continuity in Greek literature across that 1,500-year time span between antiquity and modernity, and I study a lot of that. And so I'm naturally interested in the question of where does that fit into our broader picture of Greek literature diachronically, and if it doesn't fit in, why not? So I thought this would be a great opportunity to discuss the whole ancient, medieval, modern dynamic as it applies to the study of Greek literature diachronically. At the same time, I find just the academic question of stepping outside your field to write about a sort of different topic, perhaps adjacent, perhaps related, but definitely requiring a different set of skills to be something fascinating when academics do it. Johanna's book is called The Classical Debt, Greek Antiquity in an Era of Austerity, and it looks, among many other things, at how this classical framework was applied to Greece during the crisis year, so in the previous decade, And it kind of distorts the reality of the modern country and the experiences of its people. If in journalists and analysts and so forth just can't get their mind out of the classical reference framework. So I found that this was also something that we could talk about because it's actually not something that I've done. I have my home base field and I kind of stick to it. It is a fairly expansive one, I know, and it ranges from antiquity to early modernity, but I use more or less the same set of skills across that millennium. It's one of very few cultures you can do this with. So I can't say that I've done something, quite so adventurous or, in fact, bold, because it does kind of set you a little bit at odds with your institutions. You have to now explain to your colleagues what it is that you're doing, and they might not understand it or think that you've wandered off the reservation or whatever. And finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was the fact that Johanna has started a podcast on ancient Greece. It's called Lesche, Ancient Greece New Ideas. That's Lesche as an Lesche, which was like in ancient Greece. This is a kind of a clubhouse, where people sort of hang out and talk and drink or whatever those Greeks were up to. And this is a academic podcast in the sense that it is run by a research active scholar, interviewing other research active scholars in order to disseminate their work. So if you're familiar with the format of this podcast, that one will be familiar to you, though it is done much better than mine. And I have the suspicion that Johanna puts much more work and deliberation into what she's doing than what I do here. But I enjoy listening to the episodes, and it's a great window into scholarship on ancient Greece that the podcast might make me consider reading, or at least acquaint me with, so that I know, what's going on. So I strongly recommend that you check that out. I'll stop talking. Let's get straight to the discussion. Thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. And here is my fun, sort of rambling, but always, I thought, very interesting conversation that I had with Johanna Hanink. Johanna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
You might be the only other fellow podcast host that I've had on. I could be wrong about that. So double welcome for that reason. You're doing us all a service on that. So we'll talk about the podcast later on, but first I wanted to talk about literature with you.
Sure.
So you are, or started out as a sort of mainstream traditional classical Greek lit person, right?
Yes.
A number of classicists, especially on the Greek side, they do eventually learn some modern Greek or develop ties with Greece. But you've done more than most. You learned modern Greek. You wrote a book on Greece, so modern Greece, its relationship with the classics during the crisis years, and now you've translated a modern Greek author from 120 years ago, a text, Karkavitsas, into English, and yet you continue to work on like Athenian lit and so forth. So what motivated you to go sort of above and beyond what most classicists do? Or what did you see there that drew you further and further into that world?
Well, I think that it was partially, structural, as these things so often are. So I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, where modern Greek was just a part of the classics department. And I think that you could even use like modern Greek classes, to fulfill parts of undergraduate requirements. And that was basically what did it for me in a way that I didn't even realize quite what was happening at the time. And I remember that I took maybe my junior or senior year Artemis Leontides' class on, it was, I think, modern Greek culture. And it was the way that Artemis brought out these connections between antiquity and modernity, and I guess what we would now call, or 10 years ago, we would have called the reception of antiquity and modern Greek literature and culture. That was what really got me very into it. And I was able to actually also start taking modern Greek there. So that was what kind of got me going on the path of modern Greek. But then I took a break from it for a while. And then I went to the summer school at the university, at the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki for a month. And really, that's when I really got the bug, I guess.
Right. I remember now, you were at Michigan. I was there probably much earlier, so in 1990. And
I met Traianos. Actually, I just heard him speaking in his office, and I just walked in. I was an undergrad also, and we, became friends. And that is so important that you say that there's just a structural arrangement of having modern Greek studies in classics can, provide that dimension. At Ohio State, it was also in classics, and with me there, we had the potential for a kind of diachronic Greece from, antiquity to the present. In fact, to Greek America also, because of Yorgos, who studied Greek Americans. But not many people, write a monograph, from a base in classics to, extend into modern Greece. How did that book come about?
So that book came about in a very personal, I mean, slightly embarrassing way, I guess. So when I decided really to learn modern Greek, I devoted part of my junior leave from Brown to learning modern Greek. And I went back to Thessaloniki and wound up becoming engaged to my Greek teacher, who has a school of modern Greek on the island of Ikaria. And when that went south, I decided that I was still going to keep going with the language and with the ties that I had worked to build for myself in Greece. And it was kind of as I was exiting from that I met my very, very close friend to this day, Konstantinos Poulis, who was then working at what was now he runs it, but he was working at a media sort of startup in Greece called the Press Project. And so right after my flight, when I left Greece after this breakup, my flight touched down back in Boston. I think it was the next day or within 48 hours or something that they had the referendum. And I had been, observing as I was in Greece at that time. I guess it was sort of 2014, the earliest months of 2014. Things were really, really heating up there. And I'd, be on the island and reading American, Anglo-American media and just seeing the way that the financial and humanitarian crisis was being presented through all of these classical cliches. And I was getting very heated up about that. And then when I came back, I contacted, this guy, Konstantinos, and I said, I know you're at the Press Project. Is there anything I can do to help in terms of like, I knew they were doing some outreach to Anglophone audiences. They served a very important function at that time for being a kind of clearinghouse of really sort of inside baseball crisis journalism that foreign journalists would use for their
Hmm.
reporting. And so I asked Konstantinos if I can help in any way. And the next thing I knew, I got a message on Messenger from the founder of the Press Project, the late great Kostas Efimeros, just saying, please help us. Here are the passwords. Just start translating. And so I was working on the live feed for the Press Project on the translations for that. And it was a really, really, really intense summer where I learned a lot of Greek, different kind of Greek. It was a lot of economic jargon. So I was learning about, debt haircuts and, all
Yes,
these
yes.
things to do with the memoranda. But it also meant that I was consuming media like crazy because I was pulling things from all these different wires and media outlets. And it became a really strange situation where the classicist toolkit, the sort of that have to have this experience of Italian, French, German, that it suddenly was serving this completely different purpose where I could read all these European newspapers and
Hmm.
sort of pull stuff and translate it for the English feed. And so it was that kind of combination of that intense, it was a different kind of linguistic work, but it was a different kind of media consumption and actually production. I wound up sort of writing some things. But that's when I decided, I think that I want to say something about how pissed off I am about the way that this crisis is being represented as this joke. Where I knew people, like everybody did, who were really seriously being affected, like, who couldn't get medicine, who, the suicide rate had gone way up. And it was just sort of not funny in this way that people, when they're, yanking the Aristophanes experts off the streets in England to go on the BBC to comment on a really complicated
Hmm.
economic, humanitarian, and eventually, this refugee crisis also got in the mix. And so I started out with a just a little kind of idea. And it was at that moment that a friend of mine said, Donna Zuckerberg is just now thinking of starting this online journal for classics. And so I contacted her, and my piece on the crisis became one of the early pieces in Eidolon,
Hmm.
now defunct. And then it was on the basis of that, I got so much response to it that I then decided to write this a book. And I was given a much shorter deadline and a much larger word count than I had anticipated, which is why then it became very ambitious. My editor, Sharmila Sen at Harvard University Press, really helped me reconceive of kind of the more narrow argument that I initially had as something about really this kind of strange triangle between ancient Greece, modern Greece, the European West, and sort of all these questions of what the West even means that get raised as a result of all the tensions in those relationships. So that was the genesis of the book.
Right. You also reminded me of Sharmila now. I should drop her a message. I published a couple of books with her, but it's been a while, and I think I should reconnect. So, among the many things that your book does, and does well, is this you explore how it's not impossible to talk about modern Greece without bringing up classical precedents, but the temptation is so great that especially journalists abroad, can't resist it. And when you start talking about the plight of a modern country with, in the terms of classical columns and ancient authors, I think it's almost inevitable that you veer into satire. I mean, it just kind of becomes that sort of genre. Always the holding up of modern Greece up against these ancient ideals that are, no one can live up to. And um, it was part of what Nikos Zimou had once called the misery of being Greek, is always being compared to these idealized ancestors that everybody loves. And
I
you
quote
just,
from that book and
yeah,
in
yeah,
a
yeah,
few
yeah.
of the aphorisms that he has. Yeah.
Yes, yes, it's a
Yeah,
book of
yeah.
aphorisms. Yeah, the misery of being Greek. So let's take this back to your sort of home discipline. How have your classicist colleagues generally, how do they react to this extension of your interest into modern Greece? I mean, is it something like, oh, how nice, but you do that, I'm not so interested, or is it as if you've just veered off into another field and they're hoping you'll come back? Do they find it interesting, or like generally, what's the range of responses that you've had?
Well, I'm really lucky because Brown is one of the few places that, like Michigan, houses modern Greek within it. So there's a great community of people in modern Greek studies here. The director, Elsa Manatizu, is just incredible, super dynamo. And so I've found a, home within the home of classics here. I think more broadly in the field, though, it has, I have this completely naive, I don't, misguided hope or idea that sort of, this would really take off as a thing, and that why what it had been so great for me to learn modern Greek. I just felt like I was able to access so much more, and it was just something that sparked my curiosity in a million different ways. There was a moment maybe 5 years ago, 7 years ago, when people seemed like they were getting a little bit more interested in modern Greece, and I kind of hate myself even for just having said modern Greece, for getting interested in Greece. Um, but now I think it's something that doesn't quite make sense. If you were to look at my profile externally, it doesn't seem like it. I think it looks kind of bitty and fragmented, and I'm always telling people whenever in the rare occasions it comes up, people sort of pigeonhole me as like a reception person because I do
Mm,
modern. I just never have thought of myself as a reception person, not in the slightest.
no, no, no.
Um,
No, that's not what you're doing. But
yeah, I mean,
yeah, I can understand why classicists do that. Yeah, but reception is this catch-all term where classicists put anything that might be vaguely related to the classical world, but that isn't what they're trained on. Now, I know you've written about this quite a bit, and we shouldn't take up, this could take up the whole time, but what are some of the things that classicists are leaving on the table when they show a lack of curiosity about Greece today and or the modern language, the modern culture? What are sort of the things that you find were sort of really invaluable that you gained from that experience?
well, I think that there are different levels where you can gain. The most obvious one is just that internalizing a language helps you to know it better. I mean, certainly my vocabulary expanded, a great deal,
Mm.
especially for everyday words. Like I can read Aristophanes a lot more easily now because I know a lot of words for food.
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So that's a very sort of banal basic level. There is a lot of stuff like if you're into epigraphy, which I'm not an epigraphist by any means, but I have to draw on epigraphical studies for my work on fourth century oratory, that there's just a huge amount that is in Greek museums, in Greek publications that is really accessible only in Greek. And this is the same for archaeology, is that you can see the signs, the sort of tables at sites will a lot of times contain a lot of technical information. And the more obscure and smaller the site, the less likely that any of that's going to be in English. I mean, the same obviously then for the scholarly literature. So, I mean, Greek
Yeah.
archaeologists are much better. I mean, it's not 100%, it's not probably where it should be, but they're much better at this kind of thing. For me, what's been most important personally has been kind of getting to see what it's like to live with this legacy in the air, a legacy that has shaped Greece to a huge extent, and to see kind of what tourism does there, where you have governmental administrations that emphasize this kind of disposable tourism
Mm.
over all else, hearing about people's experiences, seeing, perceiving from within the kinds of things that had aggravated me as a foreigner when the debt crisis was really very much in the news. Starting to feel a little bit of that weight of antiquity was something that I was only able to access in the Greek language. And something that I really love, for example, is that I would hear, I have friends in tourism and I have, friends who kind of do things with foreigners, foreign classic students a lot, is that hearing them in English and then hearing them in Greek, they're telling it's very different stories. And I'm sure you know exactly what I mean, but
Yeah.
people will talk about, the glory of Athens and then sort of in English and then kind of like, curse having a view of the Acropolis, in Greek. And I would see this too when I was on the board of Modern Greek Studies of the Modern Greek Studies Association. I thought this was totally amazing and hilarious, is that during those meetings, it was like there were two parallel conversations running where there was the official business being conducted in English. And then there was the kind of like cursing and ribbing of each other that was going on in Greek alongside of it. And it was just really a lot of fun to be able to participate in that.
Yeah. I would have a lot to say about all of that, but in particular about the vocabulary. And it's interesting you should mention that because when one learns classical Greek without having a background in modern Greek, so I should just say this. I mean, Greek is my native language, and I can't even begin to say what an advantage that is for studying ancient or medieval texts. It's just like it's cheating. I'm just basically cheating, and I have no problem saying it. I'm not like super good with languages in general, but that one is much easier for me for that reason. But you pick up a textbook of classical Greek, and for understandable reasons, the vocabulary in the texts that you're immediately introduced to are things like justice, right? Philosophy, these kinds of words. This a couple of years, a long time ago, I had learned Old English and Gothic, these kind of languages. Well, Old English in particular. And the vocabulary that you start off with are things like foot, pig, spear, right? I mean, obviously, Old English doesn't have a very sophisticated, abstract vocabulary, especially not when it comes to philosophical issues, because that was just not part of the culture, really. But you learn classical Greek, and you basically omit all of the terms of daily life unless they
Hmm.
have some sort of philosophical significance. Like the reason we learn ecos or oikos is because Aristotle makes it the foundation of his politics, right? Things like that. And for all of the common everyday words, they're just already in my head, most of them. But that's exactly the point that you said. And I see this in class where students just don't know basic words for like household items.
Hmm. Can I
Right.
actually ask you a question? I don't mean
Yeah.
to
No, of
hijack,
course.
but something that I've been turning over. This kind of came up in a podcast episode of my own lately, that there has been a discussion lately in Greece about to what extent, and discussion is a kind of very low key word for this, but there's been a conversation about to what extent foreign interest in classical antiquity is cultural appropriation of Greek culture. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I cannot figure out what sort of framework to use for even thinking about that. So this was an issue when that series was on Netflix, Chaos. The
Yes.
Yeah, the mytho, Charlie Covell's.
I started watching it. I didn't get very far.
So one of the reactions in Greece among, and it was really primarily a reaction with the far right, is because that show depicts ancient Greek mythology in all of its queer glory. So there was a line from the far right in Greece that yet again the stories of the Greek ancestors, Greek cultural inheritance is being appropriated by the European West and is, sort of being twisted and turned in all of these ways when it's so they're kind of deploying this cultural appropriation rhetoric in
Yes.
this way that we're not used to seeing it. And so I don't know if you've heard anything about that, but I'm just
Not
got
about
my
that show
mind in a kind of knot.
not about that show in particular, but I know the concern that this comes from. And in a nutshell, I would say don't worry about it. Like, I mean, even in Greece, this is not going to get much traction. Look, I've seen versions of this in the past. So, for example, the bar association of my island, Lesbos, sued as some sort of lesbian group for misappropriating the name of the island and the islanders and using it for some sort of perverse, decadent reason or whatever. I think this was in the 90s, and it was just laughed out of court. Another, I was the Greek Bar Association or the Lawyers Association sued Oliver Stone for his depiction of Alexander and like
Exactly,
these
right.
kinds of things. And
Right.
these are reported as almost comic stories in they're like comic relief in Western media, and are largely seen that way in Greece too. I mean, these are just very conservative people who, anyway. So here's why this won't gain traction. I think most Greeks are super aware of the dividends that the idea of universal Hellenism has paid to the country. They know this. They know that what Greece represents cannot be limited to a sort of local nation state kind of framework without tremendous loss to its standing in the world. They know this. When I was a child, look, for 20 some years, I was looking at a map of the European Union, then the European Economic Community, which had all these contiguous countries plus Greece. It was like this little outpost. It wasn't a rich country. It wasn't a former empire. I mean, there was no particular reason why it should be there. And we were being told, well, it's two things. It's geostrategic reasons, and it's also Europe just doesn't make any sense without Greece.
Right.
Like it's too fundamental a part of the. But in order to do that and to reap those benefits, you have to be willing to open your prestige culture, as it were, for others to do with what they will. And they've done all kinds of things with it, right? And I think Greeks understand this. Now, there's a more vernacular, sort of Romaic at-home culture, which is something different, and sort of Westerners aren't too interested in that. So we'll get to that because
You like it in a Hertzfeldian sense, or
yes,
yeah,
yeah. Patrick Leigh or
yeah, right,
Herzfeld. But it also comes up. It's a major part of the novel that you translated.
right,
This kind of dichotomy between the classical past that the foreigners are interested in to such a degree that they're willing to make an exception to the 19th century, conservative order of empires to allow for your little country to break off and become independent. This was allowed to Greece because they made the successful bid, right? That they are Greeks. When the Albanians and the Serbs and Bulgarians tried it, the Westerners just kind of stared at them like, who are you? Like, what? No, go back home, right? So I think that that kind of universal Hellenism is just too important sort of soft power, as it were. And it's not just soft. So here's where we need to add another element to this picture because I'm from Greece and I was trained as a classicist, but I don't work professionally on either of those two areas. I work on the flyover territory in between, right?
yeah, I
So
love that
those
phrase.
1,500 years from whenever the classical lit is supposed to end to when do the Middle Ages end in Greece? Is it 1980? No. Um, I don't know. Let's say 1453 or whatever. And I have seen this kind of, I think of it as a kind of bipolar, the ancient modern, right? Whether there are classicists who reach to modern times as you have done, or more commonly, it's scholars of modern Greece who reach back into antiquity and they do, I mean, this can be anything from modern performances of ancient plays, right? I think Gonda van Steen did that for a while, or just to, what you called reception, or, classical Greece as a usable past
Hmm.
in modern Greece, that sort of thing. But either way, the whole middle part is left out, right? And that's the part that I work on. And, I have thoughts, thoughts and feelings about that. No, 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 don't get me wrong. No, no anxieties or resentments or anything like that. It's not easy to come to terms with this material. I'll grant that. It's also culturally alien in a certain way. So let me give you an example of what I mean. When we say, like in modern Greece, if you were to split its culture into these two kind of modes of the sort of Romaic and the Hellenic, and the Hellenic stands for today, right? Modernity, democracy, right? Sort of constitutional, this or that. Like it alludes to Athenian democracy, not to the Hellenistic kingdoms. That's not the reference point, right?
Yeah, it's like European liberal democracy.
Yeah, yeah. It's what enables, Greek immigrants in the US to say that they're the model Americans because they come from the ancient democracy, right? It's what enables Greece to claim to be a modern nation that can fit into the European Union and things like that, right? Whereas the Romaics, I mean, if you look at it on its own terms, it's a very long-lasting monarchy. It's the tradition of the church and orthodoxy, and those two things in conjunction. And a lot of struggles were fought, like emancipatory struggles, to not live under that system. I'm sympathetic with those struggles. I do not want a king, right? And while I have a kind of almost homey familiarity with orthodoxy and the Orthodox tradition, I do not want the Orthodox Church to run society in any sort of meaningful way. Those two things should be kept separate, and I'm a liberal when it comes to those things. So it's very difficult to make them mesh, right, ideologically. And this is reflected in the literature. You work on classical Greece, and there are all these, comic plays and, debate in the assembly and all of this stuff. And you look at modern Greece, and it's a very vibrant, turbulent, right, chaotic kind of country where everybody says anything, whatever, whatever, right? And you come into this middle period, and it's this very stable monarchy that everybody is writing panegyrics for the emperors and then writing theology. And like it's a very different, I understand that. But somehow what we call modern Greece is the product of those two things. Because there's a kind of culture underneath those institutions, and those institutions sort of disappeared. The monarchy was ended, and the church was in Constantinople, which was sort of run by the Ottoman sultans. And so Greece is something to the side of both of those things. I get it. But the culture that underlay is still there. And this comes up in your book. Anyway, I talked too much. I wanted to get your sense of, like, when you were making this leap, how did you come to terms with the fact that you were flying over this like 1500 years or 2000 years or whatever it is? Like, how did you think of that, or how did you cope with it, I would say?
Like emotionally?
No, not emotionally, but in terms of like accessing a tradition,
Right.
that's a big gap.
Yeah. It is a big gap. And I think that to a certain extent, and I wouldn't want to exaggerate or overplay, but the amount of time I spent in Greece, or my sort of deep familiarity with the culture, but I think that there was sort of, in a way, it was kind of getting a feeling of things by just absorbing the culture from people there. So absorbing a little bit of those underlying kind of attitudes and things. I think that are you asking specifically in terms of the book, or in terms
No,
of
no, no, just no, just no, just in general, your relationship to this tradition. Because I see it as very continuous, especially on the literary side, right? Like
Right.
for me, one of the greatest things about learning ancient Greek is that it gives me access to just thousands of years of a literary tradition that is always in conversation with its own past.
Right.
And I don't see any major breaks. Certainly not in
Mhm.
the language. You have to get past the 16th century, really, to see that. So, yeah, I mean, classicists have this incredible skill. They can read this language better than anyone else, and they use it to work on 15 off. Sorry. I'm just
I think I think I might reject all of the premises of what you just said that
okay.
classes is I
Go
don't
on.
know how well people actually know Greek anymore. But I mean I yeah, I mean it's a big question, and I guess that, I'm not versed in the Byzantine millennium. It's something that, or 1500 or 2000 years, whatever it grew to. I think that it's something that I've become a lot more interested in lately. And it's something that I only really became kind of almost like affectively curious about after spending a month in Istanbul when I was working on Turkish, which I think I've told you about.
Mm-hmm.
That was what really pulled me in. But I think, for all these reasons that you were alluding to, when I was an undergraduate, there was no Byzantinist in that classics department at Michigan, at least not that I
Right.
know of or knew of. So that was one thing, that coming back to that structural issue. Also, the religion thing for a lot of people who get into classics. I mean, a modern monotheistic religion is not. They're often turning away from that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I think that for the same reason that in the past, not as much anymore, but classicists used to really just shut down as soon as, Christianity came about. So which is like, you have the the New Testament, you have the Gospels and Acts, and this is early Greek literature, but it's something that people who, go all the way down to the second sophistic will still never have read.
Right.
It's this strange bifurcation of things that it's like these things exist at different times when they obviously don't. And so I think that there was the religious thing, but then I think that there was also something, and you deal with this issue a lot, whether directly or indirectly on the podcast, I think. I remember that I think it was when I was in college, there was this huge exhibition on Byzantium at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York,
Mm-hmm.
like giant.
Yeah.
And I went there, I feel like relating too much of my personal life, but I like went there with like my college boyfriend. And I remember after we left, I was really, really into it. I totally loved it. And we left the exhibition and he was just like, "Why did you like that stuff?" So I just kind of felt like since it was something that was not part of my undergraduate curriculum, it seemed like taking the temperature of the people I knew, it was like, this is like just way too weird. Um, and then, throw that in with the fact that, I recently looked at the Harvard, Byzantine Studies PhD program reading list, that it's, it's just like, so it feels like just like so liturgical. And I think as a classicist, like the way it feels hard to kind of, it's like, what's my in for
Right.
this material? Where do I go into it except by doing like classical reception yet again, which I still insist I don't do.
Yes.
So
No, you put
it's
your
sort of like,
finger,
what's my
yeah.
angle on this material?
You put your finger exactly on the problem. And here's where I would fault my field too. We have not given you that angle. And that's what we should be doing. But we're not. And I'm not sure that there's any prospect of that happening anytime soon. Something that I berate so I've become now more of a historian. So maybe that's my sort of my personal sort of excuse, but I berate my more philologically oriented or philologist colleagues and friends about this point. Not that they can necessarily do that, but that the whole field is not geared toward giving you or anyone else really any reason to read this stuff. I think that's a major problem. Anyway, it extends into institutional practices. For example, the way that philology is understood as primarily editing texts,
Hmm.
so for example, no country has more philologists working on this middle period stuff than Greece. And the problem is that philology in Greece is largely defined as editing texts. from manuscripts, even if it's like, you know, the third life of Saint whatever. Like we already have the other two, and there's some variant. Okay, now okay, there's some major text to be published still, and it's very important work, and I'm not going to put it down. But there's a requirement that in order to be a proper philologist, you have to do that. Whereas in the same departments, the classicists don't have to do that, and the people who work on modern Greek literature don't have to do that. They can do literature. They can work on one author.
Right.
And so it creates this cult of technical expertise in manuscript studies on the one hand, and the literary side has atrophied. And then this is maybe just my personal opinion, I'm not too happy about what passes for literary scholarship in my field. I think it's overinvested in certain kind of cul-de-sacs, ideas of authorship. Like again, like it's all like images of authorship. It's overinvested in rhetorical templates, and it has yet to become aligned with intellectual history. And I think that is the major reason why there's no good interface yet. Because, you know, classics and modern literature are very much largely about what the text is saying.
Well, but I think that your work is really starting to provide that interface. And I hope that more classicists get into it. I mean, like a lot of people have, I've heard people mention, in conversation at presentations, your JHS article on the historiography,
Right.
that kind of thing, is definitely, your line that is so important that the texts that we have today are the corpus is the product of choices made by these scholars,
Yeah.
and so that's worthy of study. And I'm totally drawn to that actually, and work I'm thinking about definitely, going to be, wanting to do more with that. I wish I had like that wonderful teacher that I know that some people have had who
Right.
really kind of got me excited for about the Byzantine Millennium like on its own terms, the way that I did really get excited about it when I
Yes.
was in Istanbul, where it was, in terms of Greek stuff, I mean, that was still saturating the atmosphere in certain places and certain kinds of conversations, the way that sort of like classical Athens does in Athens today. Like there, it's in popular culture. I went to an amazing exhibition at a museum precisely about Byzantium in modern like pop culture. And so that was something that I wish that I had had when I was younger, because I did definitely fall prey to this. And, it's been described by people as that, this hourglass phenomenon where there's like
Right.
there's the now and then there's the deep past and then like
Yes.
in between, who cares?
Yes. That exhibition in Istanbul, they produced two-volume, catalog. There's some excellent papers in that. I remember reading it a few years ago.
That's where
Um,
we got there was when I was editor of Journal of Modern Greek Studies, is just an interesting aside. I think that um, there was a like iconostasis there that by a modern a contemporary artist that was depicting kind of figures from popular culture as Byzantine
right.
saints. Do you remember this?
Yes.
And there yeah, and there was one like in the center, like one of the center icons was a Kumbo, the basketball player.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, yes.
And so for when my co-editor of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, for our last issue, Andoni Salinas, who's a great, he's in politics at the University of Cyprus, we like did a redesign of the cover of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, and it was our first color cover, and we put that image on. We got the rights from the artist. We put that on.
Nice.
So it was like a Byzantium thing, a modernity thing, and that image got picked up like all over Greek media that we had done that. It
Yes.
was like, starting in like LIFO and like these
Hmm.
kinds of
Hmm.
places. But it was like this very interest. It generated a lot of conversation, including in national media, that, the flagship journal of modern Greek studies in North America was putting, this Greek, Nigerian Greek basketball player on the as
Yes.
a Byzantine saint.
Well, one thing that I will say for the Orthodox artistic tradition that it has that the classical doesn't, at least in the form in which we have it, the form in which it's entered the tradition and the conversation, is color. It manages to produce these amazing combinations of rich colors, whether for the interior of a building or for icons or whatever. And that's not the only thing it does, but in the kind of visual repertoire of a culture and its deep past, this is definitely something that has it's been part of its longevity and why it keeps coming back, why artists use it, like this. And it too can be used for parody just as much as the classical stuff, right? It doesn't all have to be somber, unsmiling saints and. Okay, let's turn quickly to the novel that you translated because in many ways it's about this tension. So it's a Greek author around 1900 something before the First War. It's kind of trying to work out this tension. Can you tell us a little bit about this author and what this novel is about?
So the author is Andreas Karkavitsas, and he belonged to what people call the generation of the 80s, and that was the 1880s. And so he belonged to this intellectual milieu that also included the most famous author of modern Greek prose, Papadiamandis. And he wrote three novellas that were published. The one that everybody has to read, and which maybe you had to read in school, was Zitianos, The Beggar,
I think we did read that, yes.
because that's the first novel to be published in the demonic. And that's why people are sort
Okay,
of
I mean, as
to
a
read.
as a quote Byzantinist, I would sort of take issue with that, but
Okay,
yes,
well, in the modern, in the
yes,
modern, whatever, in the authorized sort of history of modern Greek literature,
yes.
that's the space it occupies.
Yes, I think the emphasis would place on what you mean by published, but okay, yes.
Okay, right. So, but Karkavitsas was a big demoticist. He was a nationalist. He was very interested in shaping kind of the young generation into a mold of Greek nationalism. He was a big advocate for the Megalithea, this Irredentist project. And he wrote then this novel called The Archaeologist that was published in 1904. And this was published to the great disappointment of the people who had really liked his first two novels, so The Beggar and then what's often translated as like the willowy girl, Iligeri. So this one though really disappointed people because it was so like hit you over the head allegorical. It's
Hmm.
not subtle at
No.
all. And people really felt that it was lacking the attention to character development because really the characters in this, they're just, stand-ins, they're allegorical, stand-ins. So it was lacking the character development of his previous novels. But for my purposes, it was really interesting. It was very much of a piece, not only with the work I had done for the book on the classical debt book on the crisis, but also going all the way back to my dissertation work, just which was about how this notion of that classical Athenian moment was constructed rhetorically. It addresses that, and it was written at a time when there's a huge amount of excavation of Greece going on by the new foreign schools. A lot of museums are opening. They're unearthing all this stuff. They don't really have places to put it. So there's a lot of museums, a lot of foreigners coming into Greece. So if you think about like the 1896 Olympics, there was a lot of foreign tourism and a lot of people attracted to Greece because of this classical narrative. And so Karkavitsas's novel, The Archaeologist, not only deals with that kind of Hellenic Romaic dilemma or whatever, as Frommer called it, but it also deals a lot with the presence of foreigners in constructing and sort of imposing this classical narrative onto Greece, which as
Hmm.
someone who is a classicist, I was, very, very interested in a representation of that from within Greece. But it's also a really interesting allegory, and I think that this is something that is very much underappreciated about this book. It's a very interesting insider's look at all of these tensions on the Balkan Peninsula in the years leading up to World War One. I think it's kind of underappreciated for the way that by, I guess, like World War One scholars for
Right.
the way that it's representing these tensions out. So I should just say very briefly that the idea is that the Greek people are represented by this one family, the Eumorphopoulos family, and their sort of Greece, the land of Greece, is represented as the land that they own. So it expands and contracts according to what's going on. And in their neighborhood, like the adjacent small farms are allegorized as, it's really, there's Khan, who is clearly the Ottoman Sultan, and then there's the Bulgarian, and there's the Serbian, and there's the Romanian, and they all have these plots of land nearby. So that's also going on. There's that kind of longitudinal sort of axis of things. But then you also have these foreign scholars, the Sophie, the three wise men,
Yes.
who come in to look at this family's books, which are, allegories obviously for like ancient Greek manuscripts. So they come to study them, and they only prize the really ancient books over what's going on in the present, including, like, if you think it's interesting that you said this thing about color, because the novel really does a lot itself with color. And Karkavitsas is a wonderful descriptor. He has very, very vivid description. He was known for that even, in his own time. But, Greek antiquity is presented as something that's like, stony, cold, marble, kind of gray, like Kansas and the Wizard of Oz or something, whereas this more Romaic vibe is very much, it's very sensory, it's very sensual. It's like, sights, smells, like the birds singing, Mother
Food.
Nature personified. Yeah, all these kinds of, like it's Oz then in this kind of in the paradigm that he constructs. But then, I mean, spoiler alert, the way that the novel resolves, well, I don't know if I want to give away the very end, I don't know. But the idea is that there's really, it's very much influenced, I think, by kind of like German Enlightenment thinking. So there's the thesis is Hellenism, there's the antithesis, which is this is Romaism, and then there's a synthesis, which is like they arrive at the end that this is really just like one unbroken, continuous tradition that needs to be celebrated
Yes.
as a whole.
Yeah, I found it very, as I reread it, and by the way, your translation is very, very good. I mean, so kudos.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's not easy text to translate. I went and I got the Greek too, and it's that demonic, it's that demotic, which I remember from school. Anyway, you're right. It does have this, thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of approach, and the classical stuff is like, it's as you described it. It's a little, isn't it like an Apple store? It's like it's a very white and like, kind of minimalist and
Yeah.
classical, and it's a establishment, it's an institution, it's there. And then the other thing is like, it's all the food and dance and color and all that. Yeah, Greeks are almost over aware that tourists who come to Greece get only the one side,
Mhm.
and they rarely. When they do get the other side, it's usually in some tourist joint that doesn't do it justice. Anyway, that's a whole whatever.
But there is this
And
push-pull with the scholars too, who come that it's kind of been thinking about when we were talking about this cultural appropriation business is like at the beginning. So, it does actually adds a lot of like sort of 20th or earlier 20th century Greek novellas or novels do is that
yeah.
there's brothers who represent these two poles.
Hmm.
Right. And so there's one who is the Hellene, and then there's one who's a more Romaic guy. And the Hellene really welcomes these scholars at the beginning. He really loves them. He loves the attention that they're lavishing upon him. He feels really special when they're there asking him about his family's history. But when the scholars develop other interests or when they kind of try to like scholar splain things to him, he eventually goes cold on them and takes this line, which is like, you're foreign, you could never really understand.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that is a reaction that is also part of the repertoire. Absolutely. No, no, it is. It is. Yeah, but you have to live with it because as I said, the benefits are otherwise too great on the other side. By the way, how did you get Penguin to publish this? And I ask this because there's a politics of what gets published as a Penguin Classics and in Greek literature, right? Obviously, there's a whole bunch of actual classical stuff. My field has, I think, only three texts represented. And it depends on what you count as, quote, Byzantine, but they're really only three, and the translations are quite old. They're mid 20th century, and I don't think there's been some updates, but I don't think there's been any additions to the roster. Modern Greek literature, I don't know that there's much in like
I think there's
Penguin.
Cavafy,
Yes, okay.
and then there's like I think there's an anthology of poets like
Poetry.
Seferi
So
Sikelianos.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, so it's the first, this book was the first modern Greek prose from the Greek nation state.
How did you pull that off?
We mentioned Sharmila earlier.
Yes.
At a meeting of the Society for Classical Studies, Sharmila introduced me to Elda Roeder, who is the editor of the Penguin Classics. And she has been doing a lot to really expand the portfolio from everything, from just sort of maybe books that in less often translated literatures to putting some of the classic Marvel books in the Penguin Classics
Mm,
series. I met her and kind of that was in the back of my mind, I guess. But it was really after I did this little Thucydides book for Rob Tempio at Princeton University Press in his How to Do Whatever
right.
series that has really been very successful. So I had done that, and that project, I think, in some ways could look like a not very serious one to the outside. And I'll just lay all my cards on the table here. And when I was asked to do that, I did say to Rob, I said, I want to take this seriously. I want more words for an introduction than you usually get. I have like a real sort of reason for wanting to do these speeches. They're often quoted by the higher ups in politics, and I would like them to, consider the context more, but they can't really get at them. And there was no place to get easily like the Mytilenean dialogue, the Melian, or the
Mm,
Mytilenean debate, the Melian dialogue, and Pericles' funeral oration altogether. So I said I want to do it seriously, but I also knew that by doing Thucydides on my classical credentials for PUP, I was kind of buying myself some translating credentials as well that I was hoping I could leverage down the line.
okay.
And that's kind of what I did with the Penguin, is that I was a published translator at that point. I had done the Thucydides, it was doing okay, and they had that sample to look at. And so then when Elsa, who I mentioned earlier in modern Greek studies here, Elsa Manatidu, she read The Archaeologist with a student in an independent study class. She thought of me and she gave it to me. And I remember I sat down with it, and from the first paragraph, I was like, I I just was dreaming of what it could sound like in English. I just totally fell in love with Karkavitsas's prose. Just the color, the playfulness, the imagination, like the kind of whimsy, it's told in this sort of folk tale mode. It starts with
Yeah.
the traditional kind of incantation that signals the Greek once upon a time, but it's much more interesting than the English version. And I was like, I just want to translate this. And so I put together the proposal, and Elda was willing to take a look at it basically because she knew about all this classical stuff that I had done. But
Right.
she asked me at the time, she said, for Penguin Classics, what is the angle that would make this more, what we think of as like, in some David Damroshian sense, like world literature? Why would other people who are not just interested in the very niche field of modern Greek studies be interested? Because I just really pushed this like classical angle, blah, 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 in my proposal. And that was when I thought, okay, well, there's on, the one hand, the domestic novella, which I think is very interesting for all these reasons we mentioned, the coming of World War One, the birth of the kind of antiquities industry in Greece. But then I suggested adding a couple of the sea stories, the Logia tis Ploris, which are these kind of really exciting, fantastical stories that Karkavitsas wrote at a time when sea literature was a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
Joseph Conrad was a contemporary of his, and just sort of thinking about networks and interconnectivity and the kind of globalized or global Mediterranean that was represented in these stories, which were, about the sponge diving industry, or actually, another one about the sort of laic Romaic tradition for Alexander the Great. There was more of an angle there. So I think it was a combination of the two things that managed to convince Alda to take a chance on it.
I'm glad they did. I mean, it's a worthy addition. And by the way, you do literary translation. I've done a lot of translations, but they're not literary. I'm translating text to help historians use them as sources. That's a completely different thing, right? So I'm very intimidated by anyone who has the ability to do literary translations. I'm not sure that I could make the texts that I translate funner to read than they are, or fun to read, but they're important for historians, and that's why I do it. Anyway, let's also talk about the podcast because I'm also a little bit intimidated. The podcast that you run, you do it very, very well, much better than I do. I'm just going to put my cards on the table. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit what this podcast is, why you started it. So what did you hope to accomplish with it?
Well, I do not think it is sort of better produced or anything than yours, and yours was a big inspiration for mine, I'll say. So I consider you like the OG of this kind of podcast. But anyways, mine is called Lesche, and it's really I'm just trying to do with people who work on ancient Greece what you do with Byzantinists and friends. The genesis of it was that during the pandemic, when everything was reduced to Zoom, I did a bunch of events for modern Greek studies and the classics department that were just me interviewing authors about recent books. I really, really liked those.
There you go. Yeah.
I loved doing them. And then eventually I came across your podcast, which I totally loved. Then, I was kind of thinking, oh, I would like to maybe do something like this at some point, but never really actively. And then I had my baby, which meant that I couldn't travel as much as I used to be able to do. And so I thought that this was like the best way, having a podcast was the way to bring the mountain to Muhammad and just sort of like sit here in the Brown Library, and I could talk to basically whoever I wanted about their work and ask some questions about it. And that's how it was born. And well, it was, and then the kind of final thing was that I think I saw a review of Rachel Kauser's book Alexander at the Edge of the World. She was in one of the episodes. It was widely reviewed at the end of the summer, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and it was like a classics book that was everywhere. And I was like, I just want to do this. I want to talk to her about this book. So let me just get it going.
Yes, I heard that episode. And we're among very few people who are like tenured professors who do this. Obviously, there are many podcasts on classical antiquity of some kind or another. I don't know that there are many who are run by, an actual,
No,
professor of
there
classics.
aren't.
And it's the same in my field. There are some that they don't last very long, and maybe 3 or 4
Right.
episodes. And I heard that like something like 80% of podcasts stop before the 10th episode or something like that.
I
Um,
believe it. Yeah. Yeah, it's
yeah,
harder than it looks.
yeah. So do you have a process for looking for authors or books, or is it, well, I mean, for me, it is a little bit random, like just stuff that comes across my desk in my reading that I think, oh, this would make a good episode. But I also do, so like over breakfast, I look at book catalogs.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just find things and thinking about books that would make a good episode is a way to make me read things that I might not otherwise have read for my research. So that's why I do it like for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think you're right that I guess maybe I would think of it as there are a lot of classics podcasts, but there aren't a lot of ones being hosted by people who are research active
Right.
themselves. And I have definitely found that is a way of my general kind of baseline level of enthusiasm and excitement for my field and for my work is way higher now than it
Agreed.
was.
Yes.
I'm totally inspired by all these people I talk to. I also scour the catalogs. I mean, I also am kind of random, but I also, on the other hand, think to myself sometimes, well, my podcast, my rules. Like I will just invite whoever, whoever
Yes,
I
yes, of
want.
course.
It is a little bit scattershot. I tried to keep it with very, very recent stuff for the most part. The episode on
Mm.
the Cambridge Greek lexicon was a little bit of an exception. But I mostly have just been looking for books that I think would make, that I'm excited to read and spend some time with, people, not all of whom I met before, but people who I have a sense might be good conversationalists, though that can be hard to gauge in advance, I guess.
That is, yeah, that's one of the most difficult things to work with because a lot of my guests I've never met, but it has changed my relationship to my field. And in another way too, left to myself, I'm a very, very critical reader. So my notes in the margins of books are from my eyes only, but they're usually not. they, we'd be bracing if they ever got out. But
Those little WTFs are like
yes, yes,
whatever.
yes. Yes, a question mark by me is like sort of, in my mind, it's just sort of devastating. Like what? No. However, I kind of have to force myself for the purposes of the podcast to think, okay, there might be, things I disagree with here, there, whatever, but no, there is something here that's worth, broader attention and dissemination and so on. Like
Yeah.
there's something actually good going on here, and I focus on that, which is not something that normal scholarly engagement with our colleagues, we don't not train that way.
No, no, but you got to be like a hype man for
Yes.
it. And I think it's I feel I would like to think, I guess, that it's also made me a kinder,
Yes.
more generous reader and interlocutor, with just generally in the field, with students, with that you're really looking for the good, and you're looking, I think, in these conversations to elicit it.
Yes, that's exactly my experience. I've been doing it for 5 years now, and I think I have a just much more positive outlook on what my colleagues are doing because I've simply forced myself. I haven't forced myself, but anyway, no,
And you see the
it's
human
a
face of the work, right? You think about, you hear people's stories about how they felt, or like, the false starts that they had. It's just, I think it really humanizes the print on the page.
yes, and I've somewhat learned to play the role. At first, it took me a few episodes to learn how to do this, which is I've already read the book. I know the answers to the questions. And not all of them, but but for the purposes of the podcast, I have to pretend that I don't know certain things or like, oh, that's very interesting. I read it a month ago. But anyway, do you do that too? I can't tell. You're very good at it.
Oh, thanks. I think, well, I read things and then I sort of forget them. Yeah, sometimes I guess it can be hard to ask the questions that will get the information that will make the whole thing legible or understandable to someone, a listener who is not yet a reader. It's tough.
Right.
That it's a really tough aspect of communication is the best guests, I feel, and I have not been doing this nearly as long as you, but my impression is that, the best guests are the people who can turn their research into stories, at least
Hmm.
orally. They're storytellers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not everybody, not even, there's no correlation between like how great the research is or how smart the person is. It's just something that some people are better at
Exactly.
than others.
Exactly. The ability to banter, or tell a joke or keep it short or like
Yeah,
these things don't correlate to research skills. They don't.
no. No, I
Um,
feel like I have to rein myself in a lot with there was one episode where I sort of made a joke about a text, and then the person explained what the text was. And then they said afterwards, they're like, was that okay? Any more questions? Any more jokes? And I was like, whoa, okay. But I,
oh,
but I feel
you can cut that in the editing.
yeah, no, I left that in. Um,
Okay. Are you used to the sound of your own voice in a recording?
Now I'm kind of used to it. I think I was thinking about it recently because a lot of the guests will say that they don't listen to the episodes because they can't stand the sounds of their own voices.
Yes, I've heard that.
The effect of, I mean, first of all, that happens to everybody, and the effect of it is in a way like when you look in a mirror or the way that Zoom is set up, you're seeing the your image flipped.
Yeah.
And it's like when you see your image, how it actually looks to other people, it's like the right to left is like flipped from what you're used to seeing in a mirror. It's like
Yeah.
that same kind of like,
Oh,
weirdness, I think. But I'm getting used to it because
yeah.
listen, I have long car rides a lot, and so I kind of listen to drafts of my podcasts on the
Oh,
car rides. So I
okay.
listen to myself a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I never quite got used to the sound of it. Eventually I had to just treat it as if it were another person.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm just editing two people talking and yeah.
Oh,
Anyway,
that's interesting. Well, you have a very good podcast voice.
I don't think so.
I think so. Coming on this recording, it was sort of weird to be seeing you and hearing your voice at the same time because
But
I was like, oh, it's the
but I have no
professional
discipline.
podcast guy.
I have no discipline. You do. I don't.
Well, I edit a lot.
Oh, you do.
Oh
Oh.
yeah. Oh yeah. I edit a lot.
So for an hour episode, how much audio do you have usually?
Oh, well, I won't cut it down that much, but I remove a lot of filler words. I speed people up.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that stuff. Yes, I do that.
That kind of stuff.
All right. Yeah, deep fake them to no.
Yeah. Not yet.
Soon. Yes, soon. I will be
Yeah.
able to get them to say whatever we want. Johanna, any final thoughts about the podcast? You do some wonderful episodes, and I hope it continues until at some point you I I sometimes forget had people on. I I'm serious. I will meet them at conferences and just completely blank on they'll say,
You like
"Oh, what about
introduce
the pod?"
yourself?
I'm like, wait, you
Like we
were
spent an
on a
hour.
podcast?
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. That's
Oh,
funny.
oh, the weird parasocial stuff, where people come up and they tell me something that I had sort of casually mentioned in some episode 4 years ago, and I've forgotten that about myself. And anyway,
That's really funny.
that's weird. Anyway, any final thoughts?
I guess not about my own podcast, but I just think that, for classicists, your podcast has just been so totally great at opening up, sort of demystifying. Yeah, it's definitely brought me into it more, and I just think it's a really really fantastic medium.
Yeah, I wish we could do more to demystify the research process.
Mm,
It's just difficult to do. In the same way that it's difficult to talk about literature in a podcast when the audience hasn't actually seen the text. It's difficult to talk about art when they haven't seen it. I find those areas to be the more difficult.
well, TikTok's back online, so you can start doing a day in the lives.
I've never I've never been or seen TikTok that I know of. I don't do social media at all. Johanna, it's been a pleasure, and it was
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
it was very interesting to connect these two sides, the Greek literature diachronically as global literature, and the podcast that you're doing. I wish you all the success to it because we really, really need that medium to be, represented in our fields and well.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Anthony.